I'm Scott, and I'm an intern here. A few weekends ago, I think about 3, my wife Stacy and I, we went on a trip to Canmore in the Rocky Mountains, where we got to try caving for the first time, or spelunking, as some of you might know it. And this experience for us was absolutely incredible, and it really bonded us together as a couple. But there's also a few really cool things about the trip in particular. So in order to go caving, you need to wear all this protective equipment to make sure that you're going to be safe when you go down into the rock. And so you've got like coveralls on, you have ropes with these carabiners to clip onto ropes and stuff, and you got a helmet and gloves and all this stuff. And one of the most important pieces of equipment that we were carrying was a headlamp that was attached to our helmet. Because once you pass from the beginning of the cave into the rest of it, there's no natural light. It's completely pitch black. And so the only light that you have is what's on this headlamp. And why this wasn't really special was when we were at the lowest point in the cave, about 2 kilometers down, our guide asked us to all turn our lights off. Now, we all did this, and it was completely pitch black, like nothing I've experienced before. And it's the kind of pitch blackness where you can touch your face and you still can't see your hands. And it was incredible. But it was actually really peaceful. Just sitting there, it was like there was no sound, because we were all just staying still. There was no visuals. It was just a place to simply be. And the reason that's important is because we're going to look at the story today of someone from the Bible who was also placed in complete utter darkness. But not darkness that was kind of peaceful, like the one that Stacy and I experienced, but a darkness that was filled with a ton of danger and uncertainty and fear. And this guy's name is Daniel. And we're going to look at how God used this dark place and what was going on there to further his glory. So the book of Daniel takes place in the city of Babylon, where Daniel is given the gift of interpreting dreams from God. And he kind of rises to fame and fortune by doing this. All the kings think this is absolutely incredible that he can understand these dreams that they're having. And so he always gains a position of power. By the time Daniel 6 happens, he's serving his 3rd king, King Darius. Over and over again, Daniel continues to glorify and worship God in this text, and God also constantly shows that he's faithful to Daniel. That is to say, Daniel knew he could rely on God. Now with that in mind, let us read the text we're looking at today, so we can see exactly what God is trying to communicate through it. Daniel 6, verse 1. It pleased Darius to appoint 120 satraps to rule throughout the kingdom, with 3 administrators over them, one of whom was Daniel. The satraps were made accountable to them, so that the king might not suffer loss. Now Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. At this, the administrators and the satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs, but they were unable to do so. They could find no corruption in him, because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. Finally, these men said, "We will never find any basis for charges against this man, Daniel, unless it has something to do with the law of his God." Just to come out of that for a moment, can you imagine being at your workplace and the only fault anyone can find with you is on the basis of your faith? That you never messed up your job? I just find that incredible that that's the kind of guy that Daniel was. Now, back to verse 6. So these administrators and satraps went as a group to the king and said, "May King Darius live forever. The royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors have all agreed that the king should issue an edict and enforce the decree that anyone who prays to any god or human being during the next 30 days, except to you, your majesty, shall be thrown into the lion's den. Now, your majesty, issue the decree and put it in writing so that it cannot be altered, in accordance with the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be repealed." So King Darius put the decree in writing. And just to explain that last passage, I've always wondered why King Darius could not just change the law back. He was the king. Why couldn't he just undo what he did when he finds the mistake later in the story? And the reason is, for any of you who are wondering, is because of a thing called divine sovereignty, which was basically that people believed that kings were set up by God. And if the king made a mistake, then it means he wasn't kind of their image of God. He wasn't perfect, because God was supposed to be. And so they just made a law that king's laws could never be undone. And that just made it so that they would never question their king's ability to rule. And that is why King Darius could not just take this law back when he finds out what has happened. So now back to verse 10. Now when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened towards Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before. Then these men went as a group and found Daniel praying and asking God for help. So they went to the king and spoke to him about his royal decree. Did you not publish a decree that during the next 30 days, anyone who prays to any god or human being except to you, your majesty, would be thrown into the lion's den? The king answered, the decree stands, in accordance with the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be repealed. Then they said to the king, Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, your majesty, or to the decree you put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day. When the king heard this, he was greatly distressed. He was determined to rescue him and made every effort until sundown to save him. The text tells us here that Darius clearly had a very good relationship with Daniel. He did not want him to be punished. And verse 15, then the men went as a group to King Darius and said, remember, your majesty, that according to the law of the Medes and Persians, no decree or edict that the king issues can be changed. So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, may your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you. A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and the rings of his nobles, so that Daniel's situation might not be changed. Then the king returned to his palace and spent the night without eating or without any entertainment being brought to him, and he could not sleep. At the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. When he came near the den, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions? Daniel answered, may the king live forever. My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me because I was found innocent in his sight, nor have I ever done you wrong, your majesty. The king was overjoyed and gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den. When Daniel was lifted from the den, no wound was found on him because he had trusted in his God. At the king's command, the men who had falsely accused Daniel were brought in and thrown into the lion's den, along with their wives and children. And before they reached the floor of the den, the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. Then King Darius wrote to all the nations and peoples of every language in all the earth, may you prosper greatly. I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed, his dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. And so Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. So as you can see from the story, Daniel is faithful to God. Really, what he's doing is reflecting the nature of God, for God was faithful to him first. So let's talk about what a life of faithfulness looks like. Did anyone notice Daniel's prayer life throughout the text? 3 times a day, on the clock, Daniel went home and prayed with his window facing Jerusalem. Now, why are some of these details important? First of all, Daniel kept up his prayer life even though he was busy. We know he was a busy man because in chapters 1 through 4, we learned that there's 120 provinces in the land of Babylon, and high officers were placed over each one. We then learn that Daniel showed himself competent enough, and so King Darius, and I quote, made plans to place Daniel over the entire empire. So Daniel was a busy guy, and he made a commitment to keep up his prayer life even within that. Some people argue that his prayer life was kept up because as his life got so busy, he knew that if he wasn't keeping up his prayer life, he was going to fall away from God and serving him in his day-to-day work. It's also important to notice that sometimes we look at Daniel as being very faithful in a few scenarios, but he was actually faithful in a day-to-day basis. He lived this kind of lifestyle for a long time, and he worked in the secular courts. So remember that Daniel was faithful in the day-to-day life of following God, and that's something we can aspire to as well. And when I say we can aspire to it, it could sound like we're talking about, just try better and you can serve God better. And that's not what I'm trying to say. What would motivate our prayer life? Guilt maybe, and not allotting time to doing it, or maybe trying to use our prayer life to make us successful. No. For Daniel and for us, it's the reality that God has already been faithful to us, even on the days that we weren't faithful to him. I mean, isn't that the beauty of grace? That God remains faithful even when we aren't. Now, you can imagine the surprise that Daniel faced when he heard that a decree had been issued that would prevent anyone from praying to God. Not only because this would disrupt his prayer life, but he also wasn't involved in the making of this law, which normally he would have been. At this point in the story, we have to ask, what would Daniel do? As a Jewish man, he knew that God alone was to be worshipped. He knew that God alone was to receive honor and praise. So how does Daniel respond to this law? Remember what the text says, that Daniel remained faithful to his God and prayed with the windows open as usual. And of course, he was caught. Now it says Darius loved Daniel and worked to get him out of the situation, but was locked into the law that he had made. This is when Daniel was thrown into the den of lions. Can you imagine what Daniel would have been going through emotionally as this happened? He was being thrown into a dark pit for the night, with a boulder shoved over the top and no light, and he's in there with a bunch of well-known predators. We might not be able to identify with that exact situation of being a full den of lions, but if it was a pit of wolves or cougars maybe, that might help us envision what Daniel was experiencing exactly. So we might be thinking that the physical idea of the lion's den, either way, isn't really applicable today. Applicable to us today. And in a lot of ways, that's true. We won't be thrown into a den of lions. But maybe there's still some ways that we can experience something similar to what Daniel experienced. Let me put it this way. You see, Daniel was tested to remain faithful to God in his workplace. He's plotted against and called out by his co-workers, who then get him in trouble. Some of you might have experienced something like that, or maybe others haven't. It probably depends a lot on what our co-workers are like. It might also depend on to what extent we try to live with faithfulness to God and how we bring him into our workplace. You know what I mean, right? Maybe unlike Daniel, we just wanted to blend in, to fit in, rather than be known as someone committed to following Jesus. I can understand the pull we may feel to live like that in our workplace. And for me in particular, growing up, I've gone through a whole lot of entry-level jobs around our city of Kamloops. And just as an example, when I worked in one of the restaurants, it was a very hostile environment. And for me, as a new Christian, I was trying, how do I sort this out? Everyone is so angry here, and there's so much swearing, and when I put myself out there, I get attacked, and so I withdraw. I don't want to stand out. And for me, the restaurant was a dark place, a place that I was terrified, that I felt like I was in danger when I went there. But remember my story about caving from the beginning. Not all darkness or dark places have to fill us with anxiety, fear, or danger. As we're in those dark places, we need to remember that we're being taken care of. Like, there's a way that God can use this situation for his glory, and we need to remember his faithfulness. That's another big thing that we need to remember in those times. And something else that really comes out of this story, other than faithfulness, is the idea that God is in control. Daniel in the story is saved from the lion's den. And Darius the king, as a result of this miracle that God does for Daniel, proclaims to all the nations that God is sovereign. Again, that's to say that Darius proclaimed that God is in control and is still able to act in this world. Daniel's boss goes through a radical conversion because of the way that God acts in Daniel's life. Darius also then casts the people who plotted against Daniel and their families into the lion's den, and they are consumed quickly in contrast. I think it's very visible in this story that Darius and Daniel had a great relationship, and that as God saved Daniel, Darius' understanding and belief in God was completely changed. He changed where he was placing his trust from himself and his people into God and his promises. This shows that our actions as workers can still be used by God to stand out and radically change the people that we work with in our workplaces. So when we're in the world and trouble comes our way, think about Daniel, about the way he trusted in God, even when all things seemed lost. But more than that, think about Jesus. Think of what the writer of Hebrews tells the community he is writing to. A community, by the way, that is facing serious persecution and danger. He tells them, and he tells us today as well, to let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. But notice what the writer says next. Look at how faithful Jesus was to his God-given task, and how faithful Jesus has been to us. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of God. What was Jesus' joy? What enabled him to follow his Father's will all the way to death itself? You. To win you and I back for himself. It was Jesus' joy to fulfill his Father's will, and that was to win us back to relationship with him. Do you see God's faithfulness to you and to us as a community? Jesus faced darkness far deeper than even Daniel faced. He faced evil and death itself. Why? To make it possible for us, for you, to belong to God. Not only does Jesus face the deepest darkness possible, he conquers it. Yes, God is faithful. And now we can be faithful in response to him. And yes, God is sovereign as well. And whatever painful circumstances we're facing now, whatever form of darkness we now deal with, God will ultimately use that darkness to bring our good out of it. And like Daniel, when we live in faithfulness to God, our workplace or school, even when it seems like it may lead to our disaster, God will use it to bring people to himself. Do you believe that? Daniel did. Jesus did. And we can live with that same confidence now too. Jesus gave everything, gave his life for us. And when we know that, and we know that his love is free for all who trust in him, and his grace makes us so that we don't have to do anything to earn God's love, how can we not want to respond with faithfulness? And I'm going to ask the worship team to come up now, and I'm going to pass things back over to Dave.